Welcome to the Game Changer Experience. We're your hosts, Dr. Jeremy Pastor and Dr. Dave Kim. On this episode, we talk about how to turn your failures into wins. So come check it out. You are listening to the Game Changer Experience podcast, where we talk about rehab, performance, and everything in between. This is where we help you navigate common questions and misconceptions in the training and rehab world. So in the previous podcast, we mentioned the word failure a number of times and we kind of breezed over it. So I think it'd be a really good idea to just kind of clarify, like, what's our interpretation of what the word failure means and what does it mean to us to fail forward? So like, how would you define what failure means to you, Dave?
So, simply put, failure is a lack of success. And that's kind of how it's defined when you type it into Google.
Mm-hmm.
Did that right before this.
Nice.
But again, it's a concept that everyone's like familiar with from like a young age. But the way people view it, perceive it, and react to it is all different. And I think that's the difference in, treating failure as a lesson learned and utilizing that information versus just failing and just not doing anything. That the latter is just true failure, in my opinion.
Sure.
But again, it's like you could react to that way down the road and again, turn that into success. Either way, I think generally just as you're young, the concept of failure is just fostered. And again, like that's something I experienced as a kid, right? Like me being Asian, I'm going to use that here. Failure was not an option, right? Like I had to go to school, had to pass my classes, and success was like everything I was just striving for. And so early on, it's been ingrained in my mind. And that's just, I just needed to get those A's. And like, that's why I went to school. And I didn't really learn anything conceptually that was like useful. Like I was passing the classes and I got A's, but like, I never went deeper than that. And so again, like when people fail, it's a hit to our egos. Like nobody wants to be wrong because again, like it's a crappy feeling. It doesn't apply to everybody, but again, people just want to be right. And so when I feel like that sort of translates to a practitioner's mindset, I think that's where things could go awry, right? Like I think the biggest thing that people have to understand is from a practitioner's lens is like, we don't have all the answers and you have to be okay with that. I feel like up until you get your degree, that doctor title, it's like you've worked so hard and you just want to be right and you want to do well by your patients. And so if that's the mindset you have and like you don't have room to grow and you don't have that sort of white belt mentality, you just miss the bigger picture. And that's where I feel like a lot of patients don't get better and, people struggle. And I hear countless stories from so many people how, they've went to PT and the PT was like, I'm the best. I'm this sports team doctor. I know exactly what to do for you. And you're going to do this and all will be, rainbow and sunshine. And then lo and behold, they don't get better. And this isn't like a knock on those sports team doctors. It's more about like, what was the mindset behind that sort of, dialogue, right? Like was the patient's best interest in your mind, or were you just trying to stroke your ego? So before I kind of continue on, Jeremy, what are your views and your perspectives on kind of how we fail?
I think you touched on a couple of interesting points, which I wouldn't say changes my answer, but it definitely makes me look at it from a slightly different lens. It's like, I think the concept of failure is so heavily ingrained through each individual's perception, right? I say all the time, right? Your perception's a reality. And by no means did I obviously create that saying, right? But it's like your perception is truly your reality. So you talked about your childhood. It's like, let's talk about everybody's childhood for a second. The concept of like grading system is not conducive to learning, right? Like the concept of pass, fail, A, B, C, D, that is not fostering like a good environment to learn. It's not even fostering like a intrigue to learn. That's fostering fear of failure, like you said, right? Like I'm afraid of a couple things. I'm afraid to fail, right? Because obviously, if I do, I get held back, or I don't get to move on, or I don't get to get into a good school. I'm afraid to fail because maybe I have some pressure at home, right? My parents expect so much of me, or I need that scholarship because financially I can't move on to the next step. I'm afraid to fail or do poorly because other people are going to think that I'm dumb, or other people are thinking I'm not smart enough, right? And all these things, to a degree, some of it's real just based off of how the system's created, but a lot of it is your perception, right? So there's the system is not created in order to foster learning. The system is created in order to arbitrarily get what we deem to be this like superlative mark, right? So I do think that failure as a whole comes down to like your perception of whatever the context of what you deem to be failing in. And I think you made another really good point when you talked about just kind of the mindset of the clinician, right? And I think that we all probably are at fault for this a little bit. I mean, I'll tell you a personal story about myself because I could still remember the mindset. I did a clinical, a pretty reputable place with respect to, they do a lot of research. There's well-known names in the industry that work there. They work with like a, very well-known clientele, things like that. And going into it, I felt like a big deal. I was like, this is awesome. I'm going to come out of here. I'm going to be the man. I'm going to have all the greatest exercises. I'm going to have like the best protocols. And again, whether that's true or not, this has nothing to do with that place. It's just like, I'm talking about me. I'm talking about the story that I was telling myself in response to that experience. Right. And, it's like you come out of there with this perception that like, I'm learning from people that are really well known. So I'm going to be the best. And this way is going to be the right way. And it's like, the reason I say that is you kind of made a point where it's like, when you get that doctor, it's like, yeah, like when you get to that point where you almost tell yourself a story, like you made it, whatever that means, right? You made it. If you experience something that you deem to be, I'm wrong, or I'm a failure, it's almost like you think it's a knock on you, right? It's almost like it means that, oh no, if I admit that I'm wrong about something, someone's going to think less of me, and they previously held me to this high regard. So now it's like a knock on like my identity. It's a knock on my stance within my profession. Again, whatever that means. So I thought that was a great point, because I didn't give it that much thought, but I think there's a lot of truth to that, right? And again, a lot of it is just perception. Like I think what the more important part, and obviously this comes a little bit with experience, right? As we get older and as we just kind of gain a little bit more humility and a better perspective on the world and on life, it's more so like, what do you do in response to that failure? Right. And how do you prevent the same failure from happening twice? Right. Or how do you make the next failure smaller than the last? Right. Or how do you use that failure in order to help feed the next 1,000 successes? Right. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, if we're talking about perception, how do you take better care of yourself emotionally and mentally to better frame these situations, to not put yourself in a position to think that everything that doesn't go exactly as planned is considered a failure?
Right. Yeah. I mean, just being in this world, like nothing's set in stone, right? In the previous episode, when we talked about, predictors of injury, there are things we can control and there are things we can't control. And like stuff happens. Right. And you have to be okay with it. But the important thing is like, can you pivot in relation to an event that doesn't go your way? Right. Like, are you going to call it a failure and blame others and, avoid situations that might call for failures in the future? Or are you just going to attack it head on, be okay with the things you're presented with? And then from there, make an educated guess, or not guess, but educated decision, and then see what kind of yields from that, right? Like me doing this podcast, not easy. Like I'm introverted. I do well speaking to others, right? But when it comes to like putting myself out there, I'm still scared of failure. I'm scared of people, how they're going to judge me, whatever. But at the end of the day, like that's on me. Like that's my perception of that is based off my own ego, right? Like I want people to be like, oh yeah, I'm listening to Dave on Game Changer Experience and he sounds so smart and he's, easy to listen to, but shit, like whatever, right? Because at the end of the
Sure.
day, this isn't for me. It's not for you. It's for those who are listening. So it's a moment for me to just kind of like put my ego aside. I'm gonna keep showing up, and not every episode's gonna be perfect, but it is what it is.
Oh, please. The first one I posted the unedited version. We started as imperfect as it could possibly be. I'm not afraid to admit that. But yeah, I think it's like the concept of don't let your highs get too high, don't let your lows get too low. Right. And again, like we're kind of diving into the psychological side of this, which I think is great. I talk about philosophy all the time because I just find it very interesting. And I just think that understanding the mental side of things really helps us understand like why we think the way we do and how our things, how our things, how our things, how our thoughts influence, like how we feel about certain scenarios and how we perceive certain things. Because I think that you're capable of telling yourself any story, right? You're capable of telling yourself a story about any experience also. And the story that you tell yourself is exactly how you're going to respond to that. And I think that while, again, obviously it's a very abstract thought, I think it's extremely relevant, if we tie this back to the rehab standpoint.
Absolutely.
Right. We come back to the kind of the roller coaster that is rehab, right? We always talk about how things aren't linear, things aren't very black and white. It's like, okay, well, what happens in those gray areas where things aren't really going as planned? Is it a failure? Is it a success versus failure, right? All or none type situation? Or is it just providing us information that then we need to use to know where to go next? Like that's the biggest key is like I always say to people that our job is not just to get somebody out of pain. It's not they come to us in pain, they leave to us out of pain. It's also to kind of help hold their hand through the process to help them navigate those unexpected events. Because it's really easy for people that don't have experience working with people in pain or don't have experience with the complexity of pain to think, oh, if the pain comes back, what else happened? Or why did it never go away? Or what's wrong with me? Or am I just going to have to live with this? Right. We tend to think in these very magnified explanations, or we magnify these thoughts that come to mind. And for whatever reason, it's never most people's reflex to not give it much power. It's rare that it's like, oh, my pain came back. Yeah, the sharp stabbing pain came back, but it's going to be okay. It's not normal for people to think that way, right? We tend to panic with these things. So it's like failure does not mean like end of the line. There's no coming back from this. The way we're looking at failure is like, what is an outcome that is maybe not in the direction that we were hoping for, right? And then how do we use that information to better inform us to make the right next decision so that instead of taking a steep slope in the wrong direction, it's just a small hiccup and then we go right back into the direction that we're looking for.
Absolutely. I mean, definitely nonlinear. And I'll give an example. I actually posted for the first time in a while on Instagram yesterday. Yes, everybody go view it.
Way to go, Dave.
Woo! All right. So, anyways, posted a video of somebody who is very muscular. He's very tight. Just kind of comes with the territory of lifting and looking, big, right? And so I gave him the same variation. The only difference I made was just a change in rate or how fast you're performing the movement. Now, when I first gave him the exercise, there was no fast or slow. It was like, just do it. And I put a heel ramp under his feet and I had him hold a kettlebell in a very specific position, which was supposed to shift his center of mass backwards. And by doing that, you could accomplish a lot of things like creating more space and so on and so forth. Anyways, I didn't get the result I wanted, right? Like I had my intention, but it just didn't pan out that way. What did I do? Did I freak out? No, it's like, okay, what might be another factor I'm not considering? And so from there, it's like, okay, this dude is very tight. He has stiff connective tissue. And I don't want to get too like, detailed here because there's, general listeners as well. But I had him perform it slower and just kind of sit down and just pause at the bottom. And what do you know? Range of motion improved, symptoms also kind of improved. Moral of this story is like, again, I technically failed because I didn't get my intended outcome, but I use that as information to give him the right exercise. Now, with this thought process in mind, like if you're in a setting that you can't do that, like it's okay, right? Like it's not your fault. You're there, and that's just how things operate. But if you are able to be intentional and just really supervise and be okay with, not getting the intended outcome all the time, there's just so much information you could gather to benefit the patient in front of you.
Right. And to touch on that, I think the only way that you were able to find out that information is because you had that kind of recheck process, right? If you were just kind of blindly going along saying this is the right way, now let's move on to the next exercise, you would have never caught that mini failure and been able to make that adjustment to make sure that session was trending in the right direction.
Absolutely. And from the patient's perspective, and this is based off recent conversation, patients view their previous experiences as failures, right? Like basically somebody went to PT long time ago for their knee and they were doing stuff. It felt better for a little bit and then it got worse and he was getting PRP injections and all that. And when I first met him and he was telling me this story, he easily first defaulted to, it's because of my age, genetics. I'm just not suited for this. This is me for the rest of my life. And I told him like, no, like that's not true. Actually, like you have the potential for change. It's like, we just didn't do any, or nothing was done from a strategy standpoint to kind of tackle the whole system, like tackle you as a person. And so we were able to kind of do some things and his knee pain kind of cleared up. But again, it was like that perspective shift from PT failed me, I failed PT to, oh shoot, now I have the potential for change. This is exciting.
And that perspective shift, I think I don't know that I can quantify it, but if it's not the most important, it's one of the most important things that we could do early on, especially with the population that we tend to work with of people who've experienced pain for a long period of time, have been to a lot of different types of clinicians, have tried a lot of different treatment approaches, because, like we both kind of touched on, it's like the story they tell themselves and about their experiences is their reality until they can experience a different reality. So I kind of put the pressure on myself to be able to show them a different reality, just to open the door for that perspective shift, right? Because you could tell yourself you're broken. You could tell yourself you have a bad knee. You could tell yourself, that surgery 25 years ago is the reason why this, and this, right? That doesn't mean it's true. Doesn't mean that it's false either, right? We're trying to prove it false, right? We try to approach this as honestly as possible. We're not saying you absolutely can do this. We're saying, whoa, that's not enough information. Let's see what we could do. And if we can show you that you could perform something pain-free, how does that make you feel about it? I actually frame it as a question to my patients. And anyone listening to this is probably smiling right now, being like, I could hear his annoying voice asking me this, right? It's like, I say, it's like, okay, great. So you came in pain. We did that one thing, right? And you're telling me right now you don't have pain. What we did, was it like super in depth? Well, no, you just kind of leaned on me, or we just did that one exercise. Great. And I'm not telling you that that's enough, but you're not in pain right now. So do you think that you need to live in pain? Well, I don't know. Cool. That's enough of an answer for me. Right. That enough opens the door to give yourself permission to improve. Because I think that the dialogue, the self-dialogue, the internal dialogue of telling yourself you're broken, which in your mind is your reality because of your experiences of being in pain for a long period of time, that closes the door to give yourself permission to improve. because you have just created I don't like the word excuse in this context, but you've created this built-in excuse for any time you feel pain. So now you get to already place meaning to that pain and never actually dive into working with someone who can help guide you through that process. So, you said the word perspective shift, and that's the first thing that came to mind, right? I know I've said this a billion times, but it's like the second any one of my patients uses the phrase bad shoulder, bad knee, I don't let them say another word. I correct them and I go, you mean your right knee, your right shoulder, right? Or left side, it's like, right. And we just have this standoff until they concede, because I'm never going to concede. We have the standoff until they agree. All right, I know what you're saying. Like, it's not my bad shoulder. It's just, it hurts right now. Great. And there's a reason I do that. And that's because I don't want that thought to snowball in their mind to make them believe that it is truly a bad side, regardless of how long that history is. So much of like understanding what it means to use this information, right? So much of this perspective shift is valuable with reframing your experience, right? And reframing what it means to experience these small failures so that you can have enough of a perspective or enough of a larger vantage point to know that is just information. It's potentially useful information. You just now need to know how to use it, right? And how to use it for good so that it's kind of pushing you in a positive direction.
Absolutely. Now, you said that perfectly. And I think this is a good point to end, but I do want to kind of sum it up, right? Like you said, it's how you view it, how you perceive it, how you shift that perspective. Just always remember, like, failure is not an event. It's a process.
Suck less a little bit every day, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. I love it, Dave. Thank you so much for catching today's episode. If you liked it, save it, share it, and leave a 5-star review. It helps us get the message out to more people just like you. We'll see you guys on the next episode.